It's a real international audience, which is absolutely marvelous. And we're very much looking forward to our first seminar of this academic year. But before we begin, I'd like to announce a couple of events coming up in our sister series of seminars here in the UK. And the Maps and Society series at the Warburg Institute, that's already begun for this academic year. But next week on Thursday, the 8th of December, the speaker will be Šima Krtalić, who you'll be getting very familiar with. And Šima will actually be in London for that talk. So you'll be able to listen to her. It's both live and recorded. And Šima will be talking about rethinking accuracy, the graphical language and geometric aesthetics of late medieval nautical charts. So it's going to be a different talk to the one that Šima is giving this evening. On January the 26th, Anna-Rika van Schaik will be speaking. Many of you may remember Anna-Rika. She spoke at our Women and Maps event a couple of years ago, and she will be talking on old news, time, memory, and conflict in story maps of the Dutch Revolt circa 1630 to 1640, made in Amsterdam and Antwerp. That is a fully online event. So those are the next two Maps and Society talks before the next meeting of Tosca. The Cambridge seminars in the history of cartography likewise have already begun. And their next event isn't until Tuesday, the 21st of February. So after our next Tosca seminar, that will be an online session, and it will be Alan Marcus on the 21st of February talking about remapping and place naming in beautiful Dachau. And so I'll move on. Those of you who arrived early will have seen on screen the events we've got coming up as part of the Tosca series. So on the 2nd of February, we'll be staging a hybrid event. So both online, and you can actually come into the Western Library Lecture Theatre to listen to Andrew Honey, who is from the Bodleian Library's conservation section. And Andrew will be talking about Please Use the Postcode, navigating the past, present and future conservation needs of the Hereford Mappa Mundi. Now, Andrew not only works at the Bodleian, but is also very heavily involved in conservation work over at Hereford. So you can book, if you go through the usual channels, via the Bodleian events page, you can book for either session. So either to physically come into Oxford and join us in the lecture theatre, or to watch online. That will be rapidly followed on Thursday, the 23rd of February, by another of our map reading sessions, which have been really popular. And the book that we will be covering this time is Encounters in the New World, Jesuit Cartography of the Americas by Mirela Altish from the University of Zagreb. And she will be in conversation with our very own Liz Bagent. So you may remember last year we had Time in Maps, and the previous year we had Matthew Edney's new cartography book. So it's a tried and trusted formula, and it makes for a really interesting session. And on Thursday, the 4th of May, again, a fully online event, an illustrated encyclopedia of this great and varied universe, mapping the Crystal Palace at Sydenham, 1854 to 1936. And that will be the Ashmoleans' Madeline Hewitson. So that sounds absolutely fascinating. And then to finish off this academic year, on Thursday, the 25th of May, there will be an in-person only event, our annual field trip. So it's a case of get your walking boots ready. Well, not really. We will be having a jolly for Peter Jolly, maps from the British Cartographic Society Awards collection. So that's going to be something which will be staged here in the Western Library. Peter Jolly, for those of you who don't know him, is a past president of the British Cartographic Society and was also a volunteer here in the map section at the Bodleian. And sadly, he died earlier this year. And we'd like to showcase some of Peter's work. Peter was also very involved in his time working with Esri, who had, over the years, have been very generous sponsors of the Oxford seminars in cartography. So it seems a highly appropriate thing to do. If you want to come along to that, places are strictly limited. We can only accommodate about 25 people, and you need to contact me and I can book you in. So that is the field trip. So just a bit of housekeeping information for today. The event, as you probably noticed, is being recorded, but you as audience members will not be visible in the recordings. If you've got any questions for Šima, please pop them in the Q&A box, which you'll see at the bottom of the screen. That's where we will be looking for them. So please don't put them in the chat, put them in the Q&A. And again, if you'd like to hear more about the Oxford seminars and cartography, then do contact us on tosca@bodleian.ox.ac.uk. We can add you to our mailing lists. We can send out lots of information. So this evening, I am thrilled to welcome Šima Krtalić from the University of Lisbon. She will be talking, her subject is Cartographers, Craftsmen and Artists, Collaboration and Cross-Pollination in the Creation of Nautical Charts. Now, I came across Šima earlier this year at the International Conference on the History of Cartography in Bucharest in Romania. I think neither Šima nor myself were physically in Romania, but she gave a fantastic paper. And I thought, wouldn't it be great to have her come along and speak to Tosca? Now, for those of you who don't know her, she has a Bachelor in Liberal Arts from the Sarah Lawrence College, Master in Archaeological Material Science at the Universidade de Évora, PhD candidate in the History of Sciences at the University of Lisbon. She's got professional experience in translation and pedagogy and an academic background in art, history, fine art, social science, and material analysis. Her interest is in probing the function of artworks as didactic aids, luxury items, physical objects, and so much more. Her previous work on cartography included a study of the materials, production methods, and context of the maps included in Antonio Boccaro's Livro das Plantas de Todas as Fortalezas. Excuse the pronunciation there. Šima's current research centers on the aesthetic logic of portolan charts and the ways their designs were executed and transmitted and their functions as social signifiers. So in this talk, Šima will approach manuscript nautical cartography from the angle of artisanal practices, exploring the methods used by chart makers to produce exquisitely intricate depictions of marine space. So Šima, over to you. Really looking forward to this.
All right, I'm unmuted. Can you hear me? Somebody affirm?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, then I'm going to commence the screen sharing. Right. Share.
It's looking good, Šima.
Full screen. All right, I think we're ready to go.
Perfect.
Shall I
yes.
begin?
Yes, please.
All right. So I want to start by thanking Nick and the organizers for the invitation. It's an honor to be speaking to all of you today. And I hope that some of you, like me, are enjoying the digital format as a chance to watch from the comforts of home. So today's talk will cover some of the themes addressed in my recent paper for Imago Mundi, as well as some of the material I talked about at the ICHC. But having taken several research missions since those events occurred, I'm going to introduce some new findings today, and I'll also be commenting more on the practical side of investigating my topics, specifically how to approach nautical charts from the materials standpoint, especially without elaborate instrumentation and a full conservation lab at hand. And in that more informal vein, rather than starting with conclusions and trying to convince you of things, I hope to walk you through my thinking as I tried to understand how chart making really worked. So here's our plan. It's going to be in two parts. The first part, I'm going to explore some of the ways the coastlines on charts were copied from workshop models and look at how these techniques demonstrate contacts between various art forms, but were adapted to suit the unique needs of chart makers. Although scholars nowadays often live in the bubbles of their own specialties, I hope to show you this wasn't the case among artisans in the late medieval and early modern period. I will then move on to look at cases when cartographers didn't just use a method that was also used in other arts, but actually enlisted the aid of specialists. These included scribes, colorists, miniaturists, and bookbinders. My interest here is not to establish the existence of a collaboration or necessarily identify the collaborator, but rather to probe the mechanics of how these interactions worked. So let's get started. Coming from the background that Nick mentioned, as well as before I went to Sarah Lawrence, I studied fine art as a painting major for 2 years at Maryland Institute College of Art. The nautical charts presented to me a tremendous and difficult puzzle. How were these chart makers able to produce such faithful replications of such intricate drawings, seemingly without leaving a trace? And I've checked on the degree of faithfulness that they were capable of, and it is astonishing. So these key questions about pragmatic aspects of chart making have already been brewing since the 1980s. And I want to point out a couple of really important contributions there. The first being Tony Campbell's chapter in the history of cartography, where he paid close attention and emphasized the role of copying in the manufacture of charts and the role of workshop models for this purpose. I would also like to highlight Falchetta's book, where he proposes looking beyond books on chart making and looking, for example, into handbooks from artists to gain insight into how charts were made. And finally, to point out Kevin Sheehan's dissertation, where he used the tools of experimental archaeology to test out some of the methods described in the manuals on chart production, which are few, by the way. However, very little research on chart productions from the materials standpoint has been done. That is, from examining evidence on the charts themselves. And that's the kind of gap I've been trying to fill in. So I want to start with the earliest charts and one of the earliest methods of copying. In front of you are the carte Pizan, the Lucca chart, and the carte d'Avignon, some of the first charts that have come down to our day, and all of them anonymous. And if we zoom in close, we can notice a peculiar feature. Adjacent to the coasts, and almost always inland of the ink coastlines, there's a band of faint brownish ink. What we don't see on these charts is even more revealing. Any sign of hesitancy when it comes to drawing the coastlines, which you would expect if a person was copying from a model by eye or drafting a chart ex nihilo based on their knowledge. These charts, imperfect as they may be in some ways, were drawn with confidence. Given the intricacy of their design, this strongly suggests they were copied from a model. We'll see later the same sort of band on the works of Pietro Visconti, who operated in the early 14th century, although those bands were so fine as to be almost imperceptible. But let's move forward in time. By the time of Grazioso Benincasa, operating in the mid-15th century, this band, still present, has become thicker, assuming an almost decorative character. And a further curious thing about this band can be observed in an atlas not made by, but very much inspired by Benincasa's works, kept at the Travolziano Library. First of all, the fact that the decorative band extends beyond the border and beyond the ink line. And second, that it seems to be used to sketch in the form of the shoal on the left, or on the right, rather. The same curiosity appears in the Cornaro Atlas, a 15th century collection of copies of charts by various authors. If you look at the top here, you can see that that band is misplaced, and then there's another band, and then there's the ink coastlines. Were these colored bands decoration added after the ink coast? This makes no sense whatsoever. All of these considerations led me to believe that this band, ubiquitous in charts up to the 16th century, was not a decoration at all, but was in fact the preliminary drawing for the geographical design, copied directly from a model. I'll get to how I believe that design was transferred in just a moment. But first, I want to make a point of the difficulty of establishing whether such bands are decoration added after or are the preliminary drawing. At least two key steps need to be taken in establishing this with a good degree of confidence. First, we have to rule out the existence of any other preliminary drawing to the best of our ability. And second, we should verify that the ink line was indeed drawn after the colored bands. This second part is particularly tricky. When we're talking about nice thick layers of opaque paint, it's easy enough to see with the naked eye which came first and which came after. But on charts, the ink and the coast, the ink of the coast and the bands are very fine and sometimes translucent. Digital images are simply not adequate to tell which preceded the other, apart from possibly the context clues like I showed you on the Cornaro Atlas and the Travolziana Atlas. In my experience, the two most accessible and convenient means of sorting out this stratigraphy are high magnification, handheld digital microscopy, and I show you an example of such a microscope on the left. Most libraries will let you use them. You just have to use a little Melinex shield with an aperture cut into it, and put it on top of the chart so that your microscope isn't directly touching the chart. Or you can use binocular optical microscopy with raking light. Raking light is light that's shown not perpendicular, but at an angle. And it's very useful at clarifying the three-dimensionality of the surfaces of objects. So you can kind of see what is on top of what using raking light and this kind of microscopy. I had the opportunity last December to spend a day in the conservation lab at the Vatican. And I was able to examine a Benincasa atlas using this second modality, binocular optical microscopy with raking light, to try to sort out the stratigraphy, which came first, the bands or the ink lines. And I was able to get a conclusive answer, which was verified by my colleagues in the conservation library, that indeed the ink lay on top of those bands. The bands came first, not after, and we saw no other preliminary drawing. This, for me, is a sign that this is a candidate, these bands are a candidate for the preliminary drawing itself, not a decoration. Now the question is, how did the cartographer trace the design of the model chart onto a new one using these bands of pale ink? And the most plausible answer I can come up with is backlighting. This is a technique seemingly used since at least the 8th century and was described as a method of copying embroidery designs and paintings. It's still used by artists today, although with electric light boxes, to copy sketches or models when making a new drawing. Kevin Sheehan also tested this during his PhD dissertation, albeit using charcoal to transfer the design, and noted that you don't really need a strong light source for it to be effective. All that is needed is a wooden frame with cords strung through it, a light source, a model, and a clean sheet. And the woodblock print on the bottom right, which comes from a book on embroidery, and using this to transfer embroidery designs, demonstrates two ways of using the method. Here with the lady on the left, we see she has the frame with a candle under it to provide a light source. Then over top of that, on top of the frame, she has her model, and she's tracing it onto a new piece of fabric. Surprisingly, though, the first textual reference I'm aware of concerning backlighting with respect to copying charts comes from a dismissive comment from Bartolomeo Crescentio, made some 300 years after the Carte Pisan was drafted. He suggests that a person does the tracing with sottilissimo lapis, that is, with a very, very fine pencil. The problem is pencils weren't available until the 16th century, at least not graphite pencils. What they had instead were metal point writing tools or ink. And when you're drawing on a frame with a backing of strings, you can't apply too much pressure. So I think the reason why the bands were favored is simply because you don't have to apply very much pressure to create a line. Of course, once you get graphite, you could use graphite, and that's what Crescentio says. But for people like Pietro Visconti, for people like Benincasa, that wasn't yet an option. So they invented their own solution. Bearing this in mind, this idea that these bands on charts are the preliminary drawing traced from the model using backlighting, we can derive new insights into well-known works of the early years of nautical chart production. First of all, we can make a strong hypothesis that despite their seeming crudeness, the earliest charts, like the Carte Pisan, were copied from models, suggesting perhaps that they were the sole survivors from active workshops or artisans, and underscoring how much of the cartographic record has been lost. Secondly, we can evaluate the degree of precisions that cartographers believe necessary in their charts by looking at how closely they followed their preliminary drawing with their ink coasts. And finally, we can gather some new information about authorship and collaboration. And I'll use some works made in part by Pietro Visconti to illustrate this point. So in front of us is another of the earliest surviving charts, and it happens to be the earliest surviving chart by an artist whose name we know. It covers only the Eastern Mediterranean, and it has some funny details on it. For example, it was signed twice. Also, it has 3 little manicules, 2 of which I show, at Roma, Ancona, and Genoa, presumably drawn by a later owner. It also has something very weird for Pietro Visconti, which is inland details. And I'm going to zoom into those in just a moment to show you what they look like. But first, I want to show you what the characteristic preliminary drawing for Visconti looks like. Very, very, very fine brown liquid bands, just like Benincasa, just like the Carte Pisan, but really fine, absolutely not decorative. So I believe he was also backlighting in ink. And we see this line everywhere on the coasts. We don't see it on the hazards, but let's see if we see this line on that strange inland drawing. The answer is no. We can actually pinpoint where the preliminary drawing characteristic of Visconti stops, which is just inland along the rivers, and where this new hand begins. And this person seems to have sketched their design and partly erased it in some kind of reddish chalky material. A similar approach can be helpful when we look at which hands did what in copies of the Liber Secretarum Fideli Crucis of Marino Sanudo. This was Marino Sanudo's attempt to restore the crusading spirit, and he produced a lot of books and got them to a lot of powerful people, arguing in an astonishingly pragmatic way how this might be achieved. Although the project never came to fruition, he did produce a lot of books, and part of the book included maps and charts, some of them drawn by Pietro Visconti. I examined the 2 copies kept at the Vatican last December, and keeping track of the typical Visconti preliminary drawing was particularly informative in sorting out multiple hands. And what you have on the screen is just one example of this. On the left, you have a chart drawn by Visconti, but with inland details, which I haven't shown, drawn by another hand. And you see a very, very fine ink coast and a very, very pale, fine preliminary drawing. And then on the right, you have a map of the Holy Land, which seems to emulate the design of a nautical chart with all of the serrated coastal details. But there is no preliminary drawing, and the ink is even a different color, suggesting that this was not made by Visconti. Around the 16th century, though, a new method of copying comes onto the scene. The earliest examples I've encountered are in the works of Battista Agnese, who we'll meet again later. Like Pietro Visconti, he was a Genoese transplant who made his career in Venice, by then a thriving center of the book trade. He also happened to be one of the most prolific atlas makers of the Renaissance. But of his life, almost nothing is known. We don't see any pale bands on Agnese's charts. They are in ink and heavily overpainted in a range of lively colors. What we do see, though, are smudgy grayish lines under the ink and paint. And it's a line quite different in its color, in its thickness, and its character than the line he used to rule his lettering for writing labels. These are the hallmarks of a technique that goes by a lot of names, but which I will refer to as carbon transfer. And before I go further, I'll give a rough explanation of how it works. Basically, you need a model, you need a clean sheet, and preferably you need a sheet that has been either smoked or rubbed with charcoal that you place between the clean sheet and the model, with the model on top and the dirty side of that sheet face down. Then, using a stylus, you trace around the contours of the model, and by means of this pressure, the contours of the model are transferred in this carbon-based material onto a new sheet. These lines can then be traced, and the charcoal can be erased. Instructions for using this technique were given in the mid-1550s by Martín Cortés in his Breve Compendio. And he insists that after you're done reinforcing those lines in ink, you should take a bit of bread and erase the transfer drawing, erase all that charcoal. But funny enough, a lot of cartographers didn't seem to listen, didn't seem to care, or didn't seem to be able, as you can see in the examples above. You can also see marks of carbon transfer at sea, where they're often used to block in shoals and coastal hazards. As you may have guessed, as I'm stressing this in the first part of this presentation, this technique was not solely used in chart production. Its application in arts was mainly for transferring sketches onto panels. And it's harder to track its origins in the fine arts than in cartography, because often the preliminary drawing on panel paintings is concealed under the layers of paint, requiring not only infrared reflectography to see the preliminary drawing, but judicious interpretation to assess whether the drawing was done freehand or transferred from a model. But on this unfinished altarpiece, we can maybe hypothesize that an element of carbon transfer was used because these lines are dark and they're very confident and they cover just the essentials. So just what was needed from the model to guide the addition of details. And now let's turn to the final method of chart copying I'm going to talk about today. A technique I encountered with tremendous delight less than 2 weeks ago in the Lorenziana Library in Florence, pricking and pouncing. Before I go into examples, I should explain how this works. And yes, it is still used today. So what you do is you take your model and you make a ton of little tiny holes in it, following the coastlines. Then you put your model on top of a new sheet of parchment and you take a bag of pounce, which is powdered charcoal or chalk or whatever material you want to use, something fine, and you pat down over the holes. And this dust passes through the model onto the new sheet, and there you have a kind of connect the dots. And you'll notice that this leaves the model dirty, but there's a way to avoid this problem, which is rather than just pricking the model, you prick the model plus an extra sheet, and then you just pounce that extra sheet. So that way your model stays clean. And on this topic, I can't recommend enough a beautiful book, which I've cited on the left by Carmen Bamba, to which my research owes a great debt. It's out of print to the best of my knowledge, but Carmen has made large parts of it, if not all, available for download on academia. So if you want to check it out, go there. And this technique had a wide variety of uses beyond nautical cartography. And in fact, I found it rather implausible that it was used for nautical cartography, even though Crescentio said that it was. We see how this makes more sense in other arts because the lines and curves are less intricate. You don't need to prick so often in order to capture a curve. And this is just one pretty example, right? A drawing by Raffaello where you can see the pounce dots. The origins seem to have been transmission from China because Chinese artisans used this to transfer embroidery designs from at least the 10th century. So as I already alluded to, I was skeptical and didn't believe this was useful for nautical charts just because they're so detailed. But I did find evidence for their use on chart adjacent cartography, specifically in Isolario, island books. All of these examples I'm showing you are from large-scale depictions on paper. 2 of them are from Isolario, and 1 of them is a large-scale depiction of the Balearics in an atlas from the 17th century. These 2 factors of scale and paper support seem to me important. First of all, because the pricking and pouncing technique is better suited to less intricate lines where you have more space to describe the curve with less dots. And second, because paper is fibrous, so it's more likely to trap the charcoal of the dots than parchment. So we're more likely to see the pounce dots survive, I believe, on paper rather than on parchment. So what have we come to? It's described by Crescentio, but I have seen no surviving charts with pounce dots or that were pricked from before the 17th century. All the examples I found are large-scale representations on paper, not charts, and it seems potentially unsuitable. So the question is, was this used? And is it even viable for such a small scale as a nautical chart of the Mediterranean, for example? And a partial answer to this question came from a very recent examination of a codex by Enricus Martellus, believed by Almagia to have been a sort of model book. Although nominally an isolario, this book also includes a world map and 3 copies of nautical charts, albeit lacking their rung lines. And you can see one in the top right corner. When I examined this codex, it was not surprising to me to see pounce dots on some of the large-scale depictions, indicating that Martellus had copied his designs from other sources into his model book. This is the case on the big pull-out picture of Crete. And if it's hard for you guys to see, what I suggest is you see these golden mountains, you want to look just inland on the white part. And there you can see the faint pounce dots. The world map, on the other hand, wasn't just a simple copy and trace affair. This was a design that Martellus had to work at. It is full of redrawings, overpaintings, attempted erasures. In short, it is a mess. This is the messy work we don't often get to see from cartographers, the labor of creating a new model chart. I discuss this chart in a forthcoming book co-written with Joaquim Alves Gaspar, The Cartography of Magellan, and I'll certainly be discussing it a lot more in my dissertation. And after all of that work, which we can see Martellus put into it, we might wonder, did he ever use this model? And the answer appears to be an emphatic yes. Because once we look at the chart under transmitted light, literally just putting a cell phone behind the page, a series of pounce holes immediately emerges, allowing us to see not only did Martellus likely make a copy from this model, but to see which of the lines he decided were the most accurate representations of the coasts. Interestingly, the mountains and rivers are also covered, showing that he cared about the placement of those to quite a surprising degree. The spacing between these dots ranges from submillimetric to 1 millimeter. This is a kind of spacing that would be adequate to copy a nautical chart of the Mediterranean. So it may be, after all, that some chart makers made use of this technique, but thanks to the relative smoothness of parchment, for this model book is on paper, they were able to erase the signs of the process. And before I move on to the second half of this talk, I want to spend a couple words on Arabic charts, because all we've been looking at so far are European charts. And by the early modern period, and even the late medieval period, Arab chart makers were making their own work, making charts, although often influenced by European models. Much work remains and is being done to elucidate the production methods of such charts. Several of them survive, and I was fortunate enough to examine some in the Topkapı Palace over the summer on a research mission with Joaquim Alves Gaspar. One might wonder, one being me, where Arab map makers use the same methods of copying as their European counterparts, or favored different techniques. Was there an exchange of production methods or just of geographical patterns? And I'll show you two answers on two charts. The first is an exquisite chart made by, I beg you to read the name yourself because I will pronounce it egregiously. But it's a lovely chart from the 15th century. And when we look at the coastlines with low resolution microscopy, we can see the same kind of pale brown bands that we saw with Visconti, Benincasa, the carte Pisan, the bands that seem to indicate backlighting in ink as a copying technique. The second example I want to show you is a gorgeous atlas by Archaeological from 1567. No preliminary drawing of any kind was apparent under microscopy until I looked at the chart in raking light, that is, shining my cell phone at an angle, not perpendicularly to the surface. And then what emerged was a comprehensive preliminary drawing executed in dry point. And I know it's difficult to see. I've tried to help you with the arrows, but what's particularly convincing to me that this is the preliminary drawing is the fact that there's a dry point course of a river that was ultimately not inked. And presumably if this dry point came from someone putting another sheet of paper over Ali Macares's chart and copying it really aggressively and leaving these marks, they wouldn't be inventing rivers. It's more likely rather that the author himself just decided not to include that river. So summing up part one, and then we're going to get to part two. The unique demands of making a nautical chart made reliance upon models and copying a necessity. The techniques that they used to copy their charts were borrowed and adapted from other art forms, or rather, I should say shared, to meet the challenges of the task. And although some of these copying methods can be identified using high-resolution images, many require in situ examination. And for people who are interested in digging deeper into these production aspects and matters of materiality, I've devised and been refining a checklist for the examination of both charts and of atlases over the course of my archive visits. So if anyone is into this kind of thing and wants a copy, get in touch. And one last thing I promised before we start section 2, I wanted to show you an image from 2 different archives in Florence that really highlights how the most basic aspect of the chart's materiality, its support, affects conditions for research. What we're used to seeing outside the archives is a nice, flat, sanitized image of the chart. What we see in reality is often something quite different. So that 1311 chart by Pietro Visconti, it's in pretty great condition and it has its own special acid-free case. It's a very happy chart. But the Carta Ricardiana historically was stored rolled up and it became desiccated. And now it is extremely delicate and can't even be unrolled fully to view. And I want to show you the bit of engineering that I came up with that I'm inordinately proud of, because first of all, I'm very proud of it. And secondly, it could be useful to people in a similar situation. So what you see is the little weighted snakes that you use to hold open books. You can use those kind of as like a truss to hold the corners of the verso of the chart, and then hold that in place with those weighted bags that they sometimes use to hold open cockled documents. And that way you unroll the chart without piling up a bunch of crap on top of its recto. So feel free to use this idea. I was very pleased with myself. All right, now let's get into part 2. How cartographers operated in collaboration with binders, scribes, miniaturists, etc. A lot of important work on this has already been done, some of which I cite in my recent Imago Mundi paper. But to kick things off, here are 2 famous examples of cartographers collaborating with miniaturists: the Atlas Miller on the left and the Cantino Planisphere on the right. I'm going to start with collaboration with scribes. When we're talking not about atlases, but about manuscript books containing charts, it's often unclear whether the chart was inserted later or whether it was integral to the codex. And in the latter case, how closely the writer of the text worked with the drafter of the chart or map. This becomes even more difficult when, as in the case of this early Catalan chart, the map was detached from the book in which it was originally found. In this case, this chart of the Aegean Sea, which you can barely see because it's so degraded, was formerly associated with a collection of katinas in Greek. But what was the relationship between the two? Was this chart added later? Who made it and under what conditions? Ramon Pujades has speculated that the instrument maker Guillem, I don't know how to say it, Cantarelles made the chart and dates it to the mid-14th century. I did a bit of digging before examining the chart in person and have written a bit on the style and its history of ownership as part of Medea Chart's Chart of the Week series, which you can find either on the Medea website or on my academia page. But new insights came from looking at the chart in person. Here's what it looks like, as you saw, under perpendicular light, the light we're used to, light coming from overhead. And since I couldn't take photos in the Vatican reading room, I've prepared for you a diagram of what it looks like under raking light. When we see the chart under raking light, we see unambiguous signs of dry point ruling in two columns. The exact kind of marks made by scribes when preparing a sheet to receive text. Thus, this chart was not a random add-on. It was not just a stowaway in a set of katinas. It was made on a sheet already prepared for text and may have been integral to one of the groups of katinas, made at the request of a scribe, perhaps, or a patron who provided the parchment. It is on my long to-do list to figure out which of the scribes involved in the production of this set of katinas might have collaborated with the cartographer based on the dimensions of the rulings. And on the basis of the same evidence, we can infer a similar arrangement between Pietro Visconti and Marino Sanudo in producing certain copies of the Liber. Because on some of the pages with charts, we see dry point ruling. So the text was finished first and the sheets were handed off to Visconti to make the charts, a rather intimate collaboration. Now let's look at how cartographers worked with binders. A particularly interesting case is Battista Agnese, many of whose works have a characteristic design for the gold tooling on their cover boards. Looking at the sheer number of atlases Agnese seems to have produced, the late Corradino Astengo surmised that Agnese kept a binder as a permanent employee of his atelier. However, as the late Anthony Hobson pointed out, and you'll see the citation on the next slide, these bindings were not produced by an employee solely under Agnese's supervision. This binder made other books, many other books, which we can figure out by looking at the set of stamps involved in the tooling of the covers. I also, since reading Hobson, have found a couple more examples of books by the Agnese binder, but I just want to show you one, mostly because it's kind of funny. So I hope it's funny to you too. So this is a book of Polybius's histories made bound by Agnese's binders. The three stamps I highlight are found on several Agnese atlases. At first sight, I was a bit surprised by it because I thought, wow, this guy has Greek language dies for gold tooling. he must have been doing a lot of erudite work. But then when you look closer, what you realize is he was very clever. He did not have Greek dies for the Greek alphabet. Instead, he rotated Latin letters to try to spell out Polybios in Greek. The only place where he had a problem was with P. So he resorted to the Latin P, making this read, in fact, Rolibios. Agnesi's whole business model was facilitated also by the kind of binding he used to attach the pages of the atlas together, a lay flat binding. How this works is you draw a chart, you fold it in half, you draw another chart, you fold it in half, and then you glue the verso together so both can open, and they're attached on the verso. And forms of this binding had been used since at least 1318, albeit with wooden boards to add rigidity in some of Pietro Visconti's atlases. This is eminently suitable to speculative chart production. Agnesi could have made and kept lying around charts at different sizes, and when a buyer emerged, he could just decide with them what sort of ornament, what sort of binding was to be added, which charts they wanted, and put it all together. So it's a kind of risk aversion strategy of binding. Agnesi also provides an interesting case study when it comes to the addition of miniatures, a topic interestingly explored by Chet van Duzer with regard to a fascinating chart kept in Helsinki. It is clear from this chart, not only that Agnesi used the help of miniaturists, but that he used the help of more than one miniaturist. We can see this too when we compare the variety of drawing styles on the wind heads of Agnesi's more luxurious atlases. In the case of the wind heads, space is sometimes reserved on the page for the miniaturist's work, with a gap left in the rung line network and a little circle drawn. On charts where this space is reserved, but no wind head is ultimately added, I have yet to notice any notes or comments to the miniaturist on what to draw there, suggesting that Agnesi communicated verbally what he wanted done. But sometimes the miniaturists were left to their own discretion as to how to fulfill their assignment. On this chart of the Black Sea, for example, the circle was drawn for the miniaturist to put the windhead in, but then Agnesi took over that space with an added caption. So the miniaturist, rather than overstep Agnesi's writing, squeezed the little windhead into the space just above the border. But not all miniaturists were so submissive. I would like to introduce you to a fellow that I call the spiky pink and gold vignettes illuminator. And I can say illuminator now, not just miniaturist, because he did use gold. In the environs of Cairo, this illuminator found himself in a kind of turf war with Agnesi, with text competing with image, an issue that pops up more than once across surviving atlases. They didn't really quickly resolve this problem. Here are two examples where the miniaturist has erased the text that Agnesi had put on the coast and plopped his vignette of Cairo exactly where he pleased. We can see the marks of erasure on both of these examples. In the process, he actually completely effaces one of the coastal place names. But not all cartographers left the placement and coloring of their miniatures to the discretion of their collaborators. Diogo Homem, roughly contemporary with Agnesi and the son of cartographer Lopo Homem, produced some of the finest atlases of his era, meanwhile leading a rather colorful life. Born in Portugal, He was convicted of murder and fled to England, where he began to work as a cartographer. He was then pardoned by the king, but there's no evidence he returned home. And he seems to have resettled in Venice, continuing to produce beautiful cartographic works. And a big part of their beauty is in these decorative elements, which are very finely drawn and very finely colored. Careful inspection of the compasses, banners, and vignettes, however, discloses minuscule writing, coloring notes. Here, for example, oro, an instruction that was seemingly followed. These instructions are even easier to see on an unfinished atlas kept in the BNF, where we can observe that Homain himself most likely designed and drew the ink outlines of the decorations himself and just handed off the coloring to a collaborator. So far, I've found 4 works, including atlases. I'm counting an atlas as one work with coloring notes. So we can infer that this was common for Homain, that although he outsourced part of the labor of chart production, just as Agnese did, he was more concerned with controlling the ultimate product. And finally, that whoever his colorist was could read his handwriting and abbreviations, which is sometimes quite a challenge for me. And the final example of a form of collaboration that I want to highlight is Diogo Homain's father, Lobo, who on his planisphere of 1554 seems to have used a calligrapher as an assistant. If we look at all of these beautiful, large, colorful calligraphic labels, near almost all of them, we can see a tiny number. And where a label repeats, the number repeats. This suggests that the numbers correspond to a list of labels of place names, which in all likelihood was given to a calligrapher with the chart already drawn and the numbers put in so that the beautiful lettering could be added. A bit more on that list. I could find 36 unique numerical identifiers corresponding to 37 labels on the chart because one of them repeats. And the numbers that could confidently be read ranged from 3 to 91. So this was a long list. All of this in closing part 2 is to note that when we talk about collaboration between cartographers and specialists in other disciplines, this is not a one-size-fits-all approach. On the other hand, we shouldn't rush to the conclusion that any and all decorative elements on charts were outsourced. But when there is compelling evidence of multiple hands at work, we ought to try to figure out how these encounters operated. And there is, I believe, evidence, if we look carefully at the charts, to make some progress on these questions. A cartographic work is an amalgamation of a large number of competencies. In understanding how they're made, we uncover mechanisms, learn about unnamed artisans, playing a pivotal role in the changing image of the world, creating aids to navigation, and bringing a global understanding of the planet to life. We've been together now on a bit of meandering journey because I was very excited to show you guys some of the new things I've seen recently that interest me and hopefully interested you. But now I'll really sum up before I exhaust your patience and return to our stated subjects of inquiry, collaboration and cross-pollination, with some conclusions, which I hope I've convinced you of. First of all, there was ample contact and collaboration across disciplines in the making of charts. Second, we can often identify the exchange of techniques between fine and decorative charts, arts, and cartography. Third, that close examination of the charts themselves can shed light on how collaborations with other artisans operated. And fourth, that charts are not only instruments and records of scientific advancements and explorations, they are a reflection of the visual and artistic, and I would say artisanal culture of the late medieval and early modern era. Moreover, by looking closely at the charts themselves, we get to know the personalities of artisans whose biographies and often even names have been lost to time, and in a little way bring them back to life. Thank you for your attention. Should I stop sharing?
Yes, please. Well, that was a wonderful talk. Thank you so much, Šima. I was just fascinated actually by the detail of your work and the precision of your inferences, really careful never to go beyond the evidence. So thank you for such a scholarly and really interesting presentation there. We have some time for questions now. Šima has kindly agreed to answer some of our questions. So could I invite you to put those into the question and answer facility at which you'll see at the bottom of your screen, and then I'll pick those up and pose them to Šima while she's had a chance to collect herself. Well, she's just having a quick sip of water.
Drink a bit of water.
That's allowed after that. Can I just remind everybody that Tosca's conferences, which come around fairly regularly, our next conference is actually going to be Maps and Art and the Art of Mapping. And so if your appetite has been whetted by Šima's talk this evening, do come, do look out for some more information about that conference, which will take place next year. So let me pose to you the first question that we've had, and it's from one of your doctoral supervisors, which is very nice, Joachim Gaspar, and who echoes really my thoughts that we are witnessing some extremely scholarly work here. But of course, doctoral supervisors don't just lavish praise, they also pose difficult questions. So here it comes. Regarding the dry point marks we found in the Ali Makar Rice chart kept in Istanbul, which strongly suggested that they are marks of construction, why use carbon transfer at all? Apparently the creases made by a metal point on the model are clear enough, exclamation mark.
Beautiful question. And I think perhaps because it potentially could be easier, you have to apply less pressure, you could get it done faster. I haven't thought about it in detail, so I hesitate to speculate further, but I really like that question. And you and I will put our heads together, but my first guess would be it's easier and with less work on the hand, because the hand can get tired from drawing, you can transfer the design. Whereas with dry point, you're constantly putting pressure and truly the hand could get tired. That would be my first guess. But we have to think about that. It's an excellent question. Thank you, Joaquin. You did not disappoint.
I like the notion of ease as a salient factor there.
It is, because your hands get tired drawing.
Yeah. Could I perhaps come in to ask whether you've noticed any geographical variation in the favouring of different copying methods? You mentioned a chronological factor. I wonder if there was a geographical factor as well.
In terms of what method was favored in what place?
Yes.
In a way, it's kind of the same question in a different way, because there was a kind of movement of chart making traditions across the Mediterranean. I would say that in the beginning, and take this with a grain of salt because I'm going kind of off the top of my head, in the beginning, it does look like chart makers favored this backlighting technique. And even when chart making first began practice in Portugal. We're seeing signs of that same technique on the early charts, but later other techniques came into play. So by the time we get to the Lopo-Homem chart of 1554 that I showed you with the tiny notes to the calligrapher, when I looked at that in situ, I did find signs of a preliminary drawing. I couldn't tell whether it was carbon transfer drawing or pencil or what. By that time, pencil was available, but clearly it wasn't backlighting with this pale paint, right? Something different happened. So I don't know that so much of there's a geographical thing. It seems more of a temporal thing to me.
Thank you.
But it's a good question.
Thank you. We've got another question now from Emily Yang, who again...
Got really dark in here, sorry guys.
Not to worry at all. Emily thanks you again for the wonderful talk, and then goes on to ask, did miniaturists and other collaborators ever get credit for their work, or were they typically anonymous? Do we know how map makers found such collaborators, or how they determined compensation for their collaborators' work?
I am not qualified to answer that question. I hope that you are able to find an answer because I would be interested, but my focus has not been so much on the identity of the miniaturists themselves, but rather on looking at clues on charts about how tasks were divided in the absence of, to my knowledge, surviving contracts that could help me answer this question. There is a project going on right now. It was spoken about, I believe, at the ICHC or possibly another conference. I'll try to find the details and email them to Nick so that they can get them to you, where one scholar is trying to create a database of the miniatures on charts and somehow using their features start to identify distinctive miniaturists and possibly give them names from other works. But I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to give you an excellent answer to that question, as excellent as the question was.
Thank you. Yeah, this is obviously highly specialist work, and it's again impressive that you don't go beyond the evidence ever. So that's very good to see. Could I perhaps ask you to elaborate a little bit about the inks and the pigments and the paints that were used, and whether you see any information coming from that area which might help us to understand practice more?
Right, so I did a ton of material analysis in my master's, and this has caused me to abhor speculating about materials just based on color. But what I can make a couple of comments about some funny things I've observed. So first of all, on one of the charts I looked at recently, there was a significant blackening happening on the red rum lines, which was kind of a famous feature of cinnabar. When it's in the wrong environment, it turns black. So there, I mean, we could posit that cinnabar was used. Also on a lot of the charts, the green rum lines, they show a bleeding behavior and a spreading behavior and a flaking behavior, which I've seen associated with verdigris. And perhaps most curiously, on some of the charts, including most saliently what I call the bell and the ransom charts, which I have a paper that I'm still waiting on an answer about, written last year. If you look along the coastlines, they're tinted in green, and the lettering of the place names where it's under that green tinting, because the tinting was added later, they haven't faded as much. So curiously enough, the green tint kind of protected the ink from its photosensitivity and preserved the legibility where it's painted over top. But I will say no more than that, because there are proper methods for identifying pigments using spectroscopy and other means, which I haven't been doing.
Thank you. Now, another question from Joachim Gaspar. You stated that the pale bands used to make the copies were not intended to be decorative. Are you sure? If that were the case, why not use a finer line?
I think in some cases, I think eventually they became decorative. They were pragmatic and decorative. And I think by the time we get to Benincasa and the mid 15th century, they're thick enough that they're adding as a form of decoration. They're functioning as a form of decoration. But in works like Visconti's work, they're almost imperceptible. And when I looked at those works with the with the conservators in the lab at the Vatican, like, it wasn't just me thinking this. They were like, yeah, that's a preliminary drawing. That's not a decoration, you know? So this pragmatic thing underwent an evolution, let's say.
Thank you. Now a question from Sarah Tyack.
Hi, Sarah.
Who again starts her question by complimenting you, and then offers a comment from the later period. She says there's an example of a Dutch vellum chart of Ceylon copied by the English, which shows pricking through the vellum, but I guess this might have been the master and used more than once to give an outline on copies to be made by others, for example, the English. Have you had any similar examples?
So there's a Sailing for the East, which is a big catalog of the Dutch charts of the VOC. It has tons of examples of pounced charts or pricked charts from the 17th century. And I wonder in a way whether this is because the chart, it was more convenient because the scale of the charts was different, or whether this was simply in order to churn out charts faster. Because the thing is, when you're making a carbon transfer drawing, you have to go over all of the coastlines. Like, you have to redraw the chart twice. You have to draw it to make the transfer, then you have to draw it in ink. But when you're pricking and pouncing, you have to spend a lot of time doing the stupid pricking, but once you have that done, pouncing is fast. So in the end, if you're making a lot of charts, it saves you time. So maybe that, or maybe another reason is why there's plenty of examples in the charts of the VOC. It's before that things get a bit confusing.
Thank you.
I don't know if that answers the question.
That it offers a very interesting commentary, and I'm sure Sarah will tell us if in the chat if she has another comment. We've lots of questions coming in now, so I'll press on to one from Stephen Johnston, who again thanks you and then asks, do your findings shed light back on contemporary textual materials? For example, any previously obscure or inscrutable mentions of chart procedures in the surviving archives, for example, for the Casa della Contrazione?
Oh, yes. I mean, they make it all much more complicated. That's the answer. A big complication for me, looking at how copying was done, is how scholars talk about the royal pattern chart and the rules around copying it. this has become vastly more complicated to me as I study the ins and outs of the practice of copying. Otherwise, a kind of key takeaway from me, which I guess is going to come up in the Warburg talk, is the incompleteness of these texts when it comes to how to make a chart, because there's so much tacit knowledge involved in chart production that just goes totally unmentioned in the textual sources. So, I mean, you could probably make some kind of passable chart using those texts, no problem, but would it be a chart in the way that people were actually making them habitually at the time? No. Because there were choices being made, if you study the charts, that are not mentioned in the text.
Thank you. On quickly now, because we've got lots of questions coming in, as I say, to one from Matthew Edney, who again,
Matthew.
he again thanks you, and then asks, have you noticed variation in the ability of those inking in coastlines to actually follow the edge of the initial colour band? He then asks, how precise is the construction of the initial colour band and in copying the workshop model?
We can't know that. Okay, how closely the initial band copies the workshop model, we can't know directly unless the workshop model has survived. How closely the cartographer followed that in their ink, we can assess. And I think in the end, I am going to end up talking about that in the context of different meanings of accuracy in the Warburg talk, because there is quite a lot of variation.
Thank you. And just to remind our audience, I believe the Warburg talk is on the 8th of December. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, excellent. So if your appetite has been whetted by the talk this evening, there's still time to sign up to the Maps and Society talk there on the 8th of December. On to another question from James Hensinger. Are you familiar with John Speed's annotating colour codes in his illustrations of heraldry? Were colour codes in common use by the 17th century?
I'm not familiar with that, and I don't know it, and it sounds very interesting. So now you have my email address, I hope, and if you would be so kind as to give me more information, I would be very curious to learn about this.
I'm sure you have access to the question and answer, and James provides a link there, which you'll be able to follow up after the event.
Okay.
So,
thank you, James. Good tip.
Nick tells me that we have a couple of raised hands. I think we won't tempt technological fate by asking you to speak, just in case that doesn't work so well. Could I ask you to pop your questions in the question and answer? Then I'll be able to take them in the order in which they come in, so that everybody gets a chance to ask a question. On to Jim Bennett, who remarks that you did a great job of dealing with the anomalies and puzzles you found. Are there any notable ones still outstanding, he asks.
Oh yeah. So the 14th century Catalan charts make me crazy, because when I look at them under microscopy, when I was in the archives in Florence and looking at some of them under microscopy, I was seeing mostly those brown bands, but at certain areas, I was seeing what looks like maybe a bit of metal point, and then my brain just like exploded. And so me and 14th century Catalan charts, we have a lot to sort out. I don't know if I will sort it out by the time the dissertation. I leave that fun for someone else. But yeah, that's still a problem. And also and it's possibly an unsolvable problem because it's possible the evidence was erased effectively. How often pricking and pouncing was used before the 17th century? That's also an open question, which maybe it's not possible to solve.
Thank you. Perhaps I could just follow up on that to ask, are there any technological constraints on what you've been able to do so far? So are there pieces of kit or techniques that you would like to deploy on these materials but haven't yet been able to? All of them. So which in particular,
I mean,
might they help you to discover?
all of them. Sometimes it would be nice. Well, it would be nice always to be allowed to have a binocular optical microscope with raking light. That is not typically allowed to haul into a library and use. Mostly for the kind of questions I've been focusing on, that's the big one. It would just, when you have these questions of stratigraphy, it gets really tricky. So that's a piece of kit that would be nice, but you can only get at that in the conservation lab if they're so kind as to let you go.
Thank you. A question now from Bruno Almeida, who sends his congratulations and asks, from your experience, why do we see various methods occurring along time? Is any method better than any other? What do you think would be the advantages for the cartographers to use this or that method? Do you notice any favored method or methods by different schools of cartography?
I notice an evolution in any school over time. I mentioned there seems to be an evolution in the Portuguese cartography. There's clearly an evolution in the Italian cartography. What would be the benefits? Well, with both backlighting and carbon transfer, you have to draw the thing twice. First, tracing from the model, second, inking. Maybe just comfort or preference. I don't know. It's a great question. I've wondered that myself, but I don't come to a satisfactory conclusion. I thought maybe carbon transfer could have become favored as paper became more available, because maybe it would be easier to, maybe paper would be more convenient to soot up and use to do the transfer drawing. But I also don't see why you couldn't do that on parchment. So yeah, I'm not really sure. It's a good question.
Do you see any sense of not wanting to use sort of invasive methods like pricking and pouncing, where backlighting presumably does no damage to the supports? I don't know if that's ever a consideration.
Well, the pricking and pouncing, it would only be on the workshop models. So kind of no big deal. All of these methods, more or less, if you're going to be damaging something, it's going to be you're damaging your workshop model. And if you compare the design like of the coast of charts over time, like I've done this with Agnese, like tracking the repetition of the same model being used over time. And it seems like these models, they stick around a while. Like if you take good care of them, you're not going to wreck them by making 3 copies, you know? So yeah, I would say because you're mostly working on workshop models and you're taking care of them in the way you know, that people do what makes sense in their case, not so much thinking about protecting it too carefully, the model.
Yeah. Well, we've kept you a long time, Shima, and we need to let
Let
you
me free.
We're so grateful to you for having got our 30th series off to such a scholarly and really rivetingly interesting start. So thank you for that. 2 dates before our audience goes. Shima's second UK-based talk on the 8th of December at Maps and Society. Still time to register for that. And Tosca talk, our next one coming up is on the 2nd of February, which also has one foot in conservation camp when Andrew Honey is going to be talking to us about the Hereford Mappamundi. So do join us for that talk on the 2nd of February in person if you happen to be in Oxford, and I recognise some Oxford names in our audience, or online if you're further afield, and we'll look forward to that. But on behalf of all the participants this evening, can I extend further thanks to Shima and wish everybody
And my thanks to the audience and organizers once more.
Thank you. And we wish everybody in the audience and on our panel a very good night. Thank you.